most of the people have read your book. Some of them have not, though. So let's. I'm sure you have the elevator speech down on this, but and we'll dive into some of those details. But talk to people about what this book is about, and maybe why you wrote it.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for doing this. Thanks to the president and to Alex for having me. It's really great to be here. And as I understand it, it's unseasonably warm here in Utah, so I'm happy,
You're welcome.
especially to be here right now. I started to write the book for relatively academic reasons, meaning I had this question that I really wanted to answer, and it was in one way personal in the sense that I had gotten to Yale Law School and I felt like this weird cultural alien, like there were all these pathways to navigate and I had no idea what I was doing there. And a corollary of that question was, if I felt like an outsider, if I felt so weird in a place like this, then there weren't that many kids like me who were going to places like Yale Law School, and that seemed to me to implicate something very deep about the way that we conceive of ourselves as Americans. The idea, right, is that if you're a poor kid, you have the same opportunities as everybody else. You can make it in the United States. We call it the American dream. And I realized, both personally and as I looked at some of the evidence, that that's not necessarily true, that there are a lot of kids, especially in certain regions of the country, regions like the one where I grew up, where kids who grow up pretty poor actually aren't that likely to achieve the American dream. And that really, really bothers me. It bothers me for personal reasons. It also bothers me for reasons of just patriotism and what I think the country should be and what it should stand for. So I started to write the book to try to answer that question. And the elevator pitch is that I realized that my personal experiences, the things that were not true, well, they were true for me, but they were also true for a lot of folks in my family, that basic pathway was actually relatively common, especially in this broad Rust Belt industrial Midwest region of the world where I grew up. And so the background, and the book really starts before I was born, when my grandparents were growing up in Appalachian coal country, and the story of their lives in a very short way is that they found work in the industrial Midwest in a steel mill. They moved north to Ohio. They raised a pretty successful middle class family, and then I went to Yale Law School. But the much longer story, and the one that I tell in the book, I highly recommend it if you ever read it.
And by the way, we will have books for sale tonight, because you're going to want one if you don't have one.
But the longer story is actually one of upward mobility in the 60s and 70s. So my grandparents got to Ohio. They did pretty well for themselves. There was a lot of chaos and violence in their family behind the curtain, but materially they were doing okay. And then the story from the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s is basically how all of the problems that they never quite left behind in Eastern Kentucky really started to catch up with our family. They manifested themselves in my mom's addiction. They manifested themselves in a lot of the family chaos and the family trauma that I grew up seeing. And really the takeaway of the book, the conclusion, if there is one, beyond just my desire to write some of these things down on paper, is that the reason we don't have a lot of upward mobility in certain parts of the country is that it's complicated, right? There's this problem of jobs, the availability of good work in the industrial economy that's really gone south. There's this question of workforce training and development. There's this question of what economists and sociologists might call social capital, the information networks from our community and the way that those can help us or harm us. It's a question of community institutions, of the viability of the churches in some of these communities, or the institutions that play a similar role to churches. And it's, in other words, it's everything from the individual choices that we make to the community institutions that exist in our society, to government policy, to broad macroeconomic trends. And I think all of them are conspiring largely in a bad way to keep kids who grew up like I did in the position they were born in.
Okay, thank you.